All right. Hey ho, let's go. This is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance. And yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order that further reshapes Americans' childhood vaccine schedule. So I have one question. What changed? Did scientists discover that some of these vaccines are dangerous? Did we learn that they didn't work? Did the diseases disappear? Because if the recommendation changed, presumably the evidence changed, right? But let's find out. So, over the last year, the Trump administration has been steadily changing what counts as routine childhood vaccinations in the US. And yesterday, Trump went further. His executive order calls for childhood vaccines, whenever possible, to be spread across separate medical visits. And he wants the combined measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, also known as the MMR, separated into individual vaccines once those products become available. Now, that last part is the one that stopped me because these individual vaccines for the measles, mumps, rubella, they're not currently licensed and available in the United States. We already have an FDA-approved vaccine that protects against all three diseases, and it's called, say it with me, the MMR. So we are proposing replacing a vaccine that exists, that has been studied for decades, that protects against three diseases in one injection with separate products that aren't currently available here in the US. And before we go any further, can we appreciate how strange that is? Because the obvious question is, what problem are we solving? Maybe separating the MMR makes it safer, except that there's no evidence that it does. Maybe MMR causes autism, except that question has been studied over and over again in millions of children in multiple countries. It just doesn't. Vaccines do not cause autism. So if there isn't evidence that separating MMR vaccines makes children safer, why are we making vaccinations more complicated? And let's actually think through what separating MMR means. Right now, children typically receive 2 doses of the MMR. That's 2 injections. If ultimately you need 2 doses of each separate measles, mumps, rubella vaccines, you are potentially talking about 6 injections instead of 2. Now, to be precise, the administration has established some final 6-shot schedule yet, but those individual products don't even currently exist as licensed vaccines in the US, as I've mentioned. Now, manufacturers would have to make them available. The FDA would have to approve them through an appropriate regulatory pathway. Then somebody has to manufacture each of them, distribute them, get them into pediatricians' offices and pharmacies, and figure out exactly how they're supposed to be administered. So I don't even know whether the eventual number will be 6 or whatever. But here's what I do know. As a physician, if you give a patient 2 choices, would you like me to protect your baby against 3 diseases with 1 needle stick, or would you like me to do it with 3 and potentially 6? I have a pretty good idea which one they're going to choose. Because one of the greatest accomplishments of public health isn't simply discovering interventions work, it's making them easy to use. We combine vaccines, we give them during routine pediatric visits. We coordinate schedules. We send reminders. We remove barriers because public health has learned something extremely sophisticated about human beings. We're human beings. We have jobs. We forget appointments. Cars break down. Baby screams. Parents get exhausted. And most parents are not sitting at home thinking, you know what would really improve my day today? 3 additional needle sticks for the baby. So public health tries to reduce what we refer to as friction. Every additional appointment is another opportunity for something not to happen. Another day off, another ride, another copay, another appointment to remember, another chance to say, we'll do it next month. And viruses don't care if you've missed that appointment. They don't distinguish between ideology and inconvenience. They see another susceptible host. The virus doesn't need you to become an anti-vaxxer. It just needs you to be busy. And maybe that's what you're thinking. Maybe that's the point. You know, maybe you're saying, okay, Mark Allen, there are childhood diseases, measles, mumps, rubella. Most people alive today have barely even seen them. And that's exactly part of the problem. Let's take measles. We tend to remember measles as fever, cough, rash. And yes, most people recover, but measles can cause pneumonia. It can cause an encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, which can cause permanent neurologic damage, including deafness and blindness. But then there's something called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Here is the nightmare scenario. A child gets measles, they recover, life goes on. Then, usually years later, a decade later, the child can begin developing developmental, behavioral, and intellectual deterioration. They develop seizures and a progressive neurologic destruction. The subacute sclerosing panencephalitis is now, we think of it as rare, but it is fatal. Think about that. You can apparently recover from measles and years later discover that measles wasn't finished with you. Mumps has gotten the same historical makeover. Remember those funny swollen cheeks? What people don't remember is that mumps can cause meningitis and encephalitis, hearing loss, and inflammation of the reproductive organs. In post-pubertal males, it can cause orchitis, which is painful inflammation of one or both of the testicles. It can cause inflammation of the ovaries. Infertility is not the typical outcome of mumps, but we shouldn't pretend that it is. Now, reproductive injury is one of the reasons why nobody who actually remembers widespread mumps thinks swollen cheeks are particularly adorable. And then let's talk about rubella. Rubella is fascinating because in many people, it's mild. It's a little fever, it's rash. You barely know you have it. Unless you're pregnant, then rubella can be catastrophic. Infection early in pregnancy can cause miscarriage or even a stillbirth. Or the baby can develop congenital rubella syndrome, deafness, cataracts, and other eye abnormalities, congenital heart disease, neurologic and developmental problems. One relatively mild infection in one person can permanently alter another person's entire life. And suddenly you remember why somebody had the brilliant idea to put the measles, mumps, rubella protection into one single shot. We didn't combine these vaccines because somebody at Merck thought MMR would be a catchy acronym. We combined them because one needle can prevent 3 very different kinds of human suffering. Which brings me to the question I keep coming back to, which is why? Why would we deliberately add friction to something we're trying to get people to do? And I don't mean that rhetorically. Let's take the administration's argument seriously. They talk about parental choice. They talk about rebuilding trust. They say America historically recommended more childhood vaccines than some peer countries. Okay, so let's examine that. Countries do indeed have different vaccine schedules, but countries also have different disease burdens, different health systems, different screening programs, and different public health strategies. Denmark's schedule tells us that Denmark has decided to do actually makes sense for Denmark. It doesn't automatically tell us which American vaccine is unnecessary. And choice doesn't answer the friction question either, because there's difference between allowing somebody to make a choice and redesigning a system so the safer choice becomes harder to complete. And if your goal is vaccination, making vaccination require more injections, potentially more products, and more appointments moves you in the wrong direction. So what is the end game? I can't tell you what's inside somebody else's head, and frankly, we don't need to. Public policy doesn't get graded in telepathy. We can judge policies by their foreseeable consequences. If you make vaccinations more difficult, more people, and some people will vaccinate later, hopefully. Some will miss doses, and some won't finish. Coverage will fall, and as susceptible people accumulate, the risk of outbreaks rises. That's not politics, that's epidemiology. Viruses don't grade governments on their intentions. They grade them on the number of susceptible hosts. And then this story now gets stranger because the executive order also calls for the Justice Department to support challenges to some state vaccination requirements. Think about that. States have long played a central role in determining vaccination requirements for school attendance. Now the federal government is potentially going to court against states that maintain stronger vaccination requirements. And we're doing this while simultaneously proposing a separated MMR strategy using products that aren't currently licensed and available here in the US. So what exactly are we building? Who makes the individual vaccines? What evidence will the FDA require? How long will that take? And what happens to the children in the meantime? What happens when a state says, no, we will still require protection against these diseases to attend school? What precisely is the DOG's legal theory for overturning that? These are not rhetorical gotchas. These are basic implementation questions because eventually a policy has to leave the podium and encounter reality. And a reality has a nasty habit of asking follow-up questions. So there's another piece of this that actually matters as well. Vaccination isn't purely an individual decision because infectious diseases isn't purely an individual event. If I decide not to vaccinate my child, I'm not assuming all that risk created by that decision. Some of that risk gets transferred to other people. The newborn who's too young to get vaccinated, the child receiving chemotherapy, the pregnant woman who's now exposed to rubella, the person whose immune system doesn't respond adequately to vaccination. That's what economists call externality. I make the decision, but someone else may pay part of that price. A good public policy has always struggled with exactly this question. How much individual choice should society protect when the consequences of that choice don't remain individual? That's a legitimate debate. We should have it. But pretending that externality doesn't exist isn't freedom. It's just sending somebody else the bill. And this is where I think the entire story finally comes together. Vaccines may be one of the greatest victims of their own success. We become so good at preventing these diseases that we apparently forgot why we're preventing them in the first place. Most parents today never watched a child struggle to breathe with measles pneumonia. They've never seen a mumps orchitis. They've never met a baby with congenital rubella syndrome. They don't remember the pediatric wards filled with diseases we now discuss as historical curiosities. And that's a wonderful thing. That's what victory looks like in public health. The problem is that eventually victory starts looking like an overreaction. People look around and say, where's all this measles everybody keeps warning us about? Well, that's a little like standing under an umbrella and concluding that umbrellas are unnecessary because you're not wet. So let's get back to where we started. What changed? Not measles, not mumps, not rubella, not children's immune systems, not the evidence showing that MMR works, not the enormous body of evidence showing that vaccines don't cause autism. What has changed was policy. Because when we're taking something public health spent generations making simple and making it complicated, we are potentially turning 2 injections into more. We're proposing separate vaccines that aren't currently available in the US. We're adding appointments and needle sticks to a system designed specifically to eliminate unnecessary appointments and needle sticks. And we're directing the Justice Department towards states that may decide they still want stronger protection against vaccine preventable diseases. Maybe the administration believes all this will increase choice and rebuild trust. Fine, then measure it. Watch vaccination rates, watch missed doses, watch outbreaks, watch hospitalizations, watch what happens to people who never made the choice but inherits its consequences anyway. Because public health policy isn't just ultimately measured by what politicians say they intended. It's measured as to what happens to human beings. And if we deliberately add barriers to prevention, then preventable diseases return and we shouldn't act mystified. We shouldn't blame some mysterious collapse in personal responsibility, and we definitely shouldn't pretend nobody could have seen this coming. Every public health problem has a public policy story. Sometimes you have to dig through decades of history to find it. This time, we're watching it being written right in front of our eyes. I'm Dr. Mark Allanderi. This is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance. Because history doesn't have to repeat itself by accident. Sometimes we make prevention so successful that we forget the disease, then make the disease successful enough to remind us. Thank you for tuning in.